Welcome to the Borderlands Trail and Ultra Running Podcast. My name is Josh. I'm the host and founder of Borderlands. I'm stoked. I've been talking nutrition lately, and I've been getting really great feedback. And Jesse, we had on last time. We rifled through questions. We went through a ton of questions really fast. Didn't let them go into detail. Now we're going to take those questions that we rifled through and do one episode on each of them. And so today, we're going to be diving into what's legit and what isn't in the nutrition industry, and what are some homemade things that we can substitute when we don't have the money to do it. I'm stoked you're here with me. I'm glad Jesse's here. Let's do it. All right, before we jump in, we are weeks away from releasing Wylder. I am beyond stoked about this. It's our app that is all about housing your run club, discovering new run clubs, finding new runs. If you're visiting Paris, if you're visiting Salt Lake City, you can hop on the marketplace and see what runs are out there, what clubs are out there, and get out and find new fun places to run. So that we're it's almost days, but I'm going to say weeks to the countdown to Wylder. I'm stoked for that. Okay, here we go. Jesse, welcome. I'm glad you're here. What do you think? What are you excited about out there?
So one brand that has recently come out that's pretty cool is called Hyperlight Liquid Performance. Okay. So they are a powder company like Tailwind, but they emphasize the high sodium. So with people doing sweat rate tests,
yes,
they test how much water they lose, and then they can do a sodium concentration test too, where they know how much sodium loss is happening. And what we're seeing is there's a pretty decent demographic of people that are losing a lot of salt, and a lot of these products aren't helping them replace that salt, right? Okay. So like you said, there's S-tabs, salt tabs, that you can start pounding down, but finding a more convenient solution where it can all be in the powder is a pretty nice thing. So
instead of having to carry extra products. So they have a really clean,
this is something too that's I think lacking, is they have a clean 100 grams to 1,000 milligrams of sodium. Just simple. And in 2 scoops, you get 100 grams of carbs and 1,000 milligrams of sodium. So it's like high carb, high sodium. It's kind of both, and they don't add any flavoring, so it's like pretty neutral. It's not like too sweet.
Yeah,
that's a brand that I think is cool. That's kind of like a niche. Perhaps it doesn't work for everybody to have that much salt, but there are people who are not being served who need more salt and want to go higher carb on both. So that's a really cool product, and you're gonna get a good bang for your buck with these powder nutrition options. So if you are trying to go a little bit more budget friendly, the powders per serving are going to be a little less. There's less packaging, right? There's less work for them to produce it. So if you are on a budget, those powder options are good. There is another option that is the cheapest dollar per gram of carb out there, which is called Carbs Fuel. So these are $2 a gel.
Okay.
And they're 50 grams a gel. So if you were to think of something like Morton, right? Morton is pushing above $5 now. Okay. So you could literally get 2.5 50-gram gels from Carbs Fuel for the price of one Morton.
Yeah.
Going on Morton a little bit too, the price with Morton, it's astounding to me, and it's kind of ridiculous because really the only thing that sets Morton apart is the sodium alginate, which is kind of the gelling agent they use.
Oh, interesting.
I haven't done a ton of research on whether or not that gelling agent is extremely hard to obtain. It actually comes from algae, sodium alginate, so it comes from algae. Maybe it's really hard and expensive to get. That's the only justification I can see.
Is it supposed
Otherwise,
to be easier to digest? Is there an upside to that, since it's appearing to make it more of a premium, at least in terms of cost?
Yeah. So the sodium alginate is said to protect the stomach a little bit. It almost provides this little barrier. Before doing more research, I thought it was actually helping to slow the gastric emptying a little bit, but that's not the case. Morton is really trying to get things through your system as fast as possible.
Got it.
Sodium alginate is actually used in the dentistry industry as well. So it's thought that it will cause less dental implications. If you think
Okay.
about these pros that are constantly sucking down sugar, like it's not really talked about, but that can be pretty hard on your teeth
Oh
over time.
yeah,
And so the
gosh.
sodium alginate apparently can protect your teeth. So it's protecting your teeth and your stomach and intestines from these like kind of what can be somewhat harsh sugars. So that's the
Yeah.
idea behind the sodium alginate, and that's why if you have had a Morton, it's pretty. It really does live up to the kind of gel title. It's very kind of like thick,
Okay.
and you kind of need to almost chew on it a little bit.
Yeah.
So yeah, whether that's super expensive or not, Morton are definitely on the high end. Probably the most
Have you
expensive.
personally run like tested the Carbs brand, the $2 one that you mentioned, and Morton? Have you used both of those while running before?
I have, yeah. The carbs are going to be on the sweeter side, and I think packing in 50 grams of carbs per gel can be a lot for people
Okay.
because inevitably you're going to be dealing with quite a bit of sweetness when there's 50 whole grams in one gel, right?
Yeah.
Morton's come out with, they had a 25 and now they've got a 40-gram gel, and the
Okay.
40-gram is still pretty sweet. Like, again, you're not really going to get away with sweetness as you increase the carbs in the gels. So if you see anything from 40 to 50 grams of carbs in a gel,
Mm-hmm.
the likelihood there's a decent amount of sweetness is high. And maybe there's ways of getting around that in the future, but that's just, it's sugar. So
Okay, perhaps we need to go to a very basic here, and I really should have done this because this is how I tend to think, but I need to go there right now. Is sugar the delivery vehicle of carbs? I don't. Is that why that's the sweetness is higher? Like, I guess, can you answer this? What is a carb?
yeah, so the sugars are the carbohydrates, and
Okay.
so carbohydrates, it's the most simplest form of carbs. So they've taken uh monosaccharides, so that's
Okay.
glucose and fructose. Those are like the most simple broken down forms. So glucose and fructose together is sucrose. That's table sugar.
Okay.
Okay, so you're pretty much consuming table sugar when you have gels, and
Mm.
they figured out that like combining these two sugars helps increase the amount you can intake. Glucose alone has limitations, so they've decided to pair glucose with fructose. Fructose is a fruit sugar
Okay.
that you can again just process into a powder. And then the kind of most used and cheapest is maltodextrin. So that's
Yeah.
also, it's a simple sugar that also has like one little chain on it to make it a little slower to digest than glucose and fructose. So you'll see a lot of maltodextrin. So these are
Yeah.
just like broken down sugar into their simplest forms to take less volume and to just get as much in as you can. But that the maltodextrin is an interesting one because it is less sweet than glucose, and so people are opting for
Mm.
maltodextrin pretty often.
Okay.
Are there implications of maltodextrin? That's an interesting topic. I think overall it's a pretty safe sugar, but some people could struggle with maltodextrin
Okay.
and want just glucose fructose. So yeah, they're the most simplest form of a carbohydrate. They give a really big bang for your buck in terms of the volume, and it's just pretty cheap for manufacturers. So that's what's hard too. You see the cost of glucose and fructose isolated or maltodextrin isolated, and you realize like if I use these sugars on my own, it'd be like 25 cents per
Mm.
serving. So like the markup is pretty crazy, and again it's going back
Oh,
to maybe the packaging and branding is what you're really paying
sure.
for, and not just these simple sugars.
Yeah, I mean, and where it's manufactured. Like if it's manufactured, you know, far, far away, you're paying the
Yeah.
essentially shipping and all that. Okay, well then that kind of eases nicely into the question here: what can we make at home? Let's say we're either on a budget, money's tight, or sometimes it's just hard to stomach. Maybe we got the money, but we're just kind of tired of dropping $100 every couple of days. When we're in big training blocks.
Yeah.
What can we order a massive bag of some of these sugars and do something with them ourselves? I mean, could a runner just eat more fruit on their run? Like, is that too harsh? Could we do whole foods? Like what should we do?
Awesome question. Yeah. So this really depends on like the intensity and the intent of the run. If you're trying to do like a super hard workout,
Yeah.
dates may not be a good choice. But like dates are a good example for like a slow long run. You could use dried fruit and be okay.
Is it because you have more time to break it down in your body,
Yeah.
whereas when you're going fast, you need it like into your system faster?
Right. You need it into your system faster, and
Okay.
all the jostling that's associated with faster running. It's just fibers, not a good idea. And so you want fiberless. So that's what these sugars provide is there's no fiber, there's no fat. Protein, fiber, and fat are all things that can be problematic. But if you're going slow enough, you can have actually real foods. Take a banana, take a date, dried fruit. You're going to be okay. But as speed and intensity increases, you're going to have to stick to those simple sugars. So yes, to answer your question, you can absolutely order these sugars and just mix them yourselves, and even get those electrolytes we were talking about before, sodium, potassium, magnesium. You can make your own blend, but you kind of have to be your own scientist.
Yeah.
The ratios of those sugars is pretty specific. So research is showing like you want a 2-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose.
Okay.
Or a 1 to 0.8 ratio, so pretty close to 2-to-1.
Yeah.
So you're doing a lot of measuring. You're having to weigh things out. It's quite an experiment to have to do it with the simple sugars. Something that I've liked to do though is I've created kind of like my own. We may be familiar with Spring Energy gels. It's kind of like a rice-based gel that I make at home, where it's just like super basic. I try to find those higher concentration sugars, so I'm not using a ton of volume, like maple syrup, rice, applesauce, rice milk instead of water. You're getting more bang for your buck there. Rice milk has a decent amount of carbohydrates too. And it's a really simple recipe. And I can just put that in a flask and I'm good to go. And the cost is like insanely small compared to, using products. And I'll put like a little dash of Himalayan salt. I don't go exact on the sodium. Yeah. So that like I probably wouldn't rely exclusively on my homemade stuff for a race, but like, during, maybe an aid station break or something, I'll have some of it or take out a little bit on my own.
Could you make a large batch of that for like to get you through a couple weeks of training? I mean, maybe if it's not everything, but maybe let's just say you do something like that and you're able to buy even 15% less of the packaged stuff that's more expensive throughout your large training blocks. Like, can you batch that stuff?
You can absolutely batch it. You just keep it in the fridge. If you need it long enough, you can just put it in the freezer. So yeah, you can do the simple sugars. You can do something kind of whole food based if you like. I've even found these like pearl sugar waffles.
Oh yes, like the Belgian
Trader
waffles.
Joe's.
Yes,
they're amazing, and like you get, I want to say 35 grams of carbs in one of those. Again, wouldn't use it for a workout, maybe before a workout, and giving myself time to digest. But during a long run, man, those things are great. So it's like $4 for 6 of them.
Ooh,
and so something like that, you think, oh, this is like junk food, but when you're running, it's a lot different. That's something you actually want to be eating. So
I've actually heard you say that before, and I've thought about it. Some of the stuff that, I mean, you're not saying it's necessarily good for you, but some of the stuff we don't necessarily want to eat it when we're not working out, but it becomes fuel when we are. Like, I'm not saying that you're saying go eat a bunch of Swedish fish, but like you go eat some like certain things that you can eat while running. Your body is going to deploy and strip that of all of its components and use them more so than sitting around watching a movie. How close am I to what you have said before?
You're very close. Yes. No, you're right on, I'd say, actually. Yeah.
Good. Because I've actually taken that advice and regurgitated it that way to others.
You're totally spot on, honestly. Like, think about it as like the more those sugars just sit around in your body not being used, that's when it becomes problematic. But when the sugars are being used right away, the issues of diabetes and things like that are not a problem, if that makes sense. So
yeah. Okay, I'm eager to hear your take on this. So yeah, we hit some high level. There's stuff that we can make at home, and I would say, as usual, first off, hire Jesse as your nutrition coach, but also follow him on Instagram for tips, and he'll post recipes and stuff like that as well. Okay, I'm excited about this. I'm not excited. I cheer no one's demise. But when Spring Energy, when it was discovered that their awesome sauce was not as awesome as advertised, I was disappointed. I bought, that was the number one thing I purchased. That the awesome sauce was the most purchased thing in like nutrition item I ever purchased. 100 of them maybe, and it ended up being not as advertised. Can you give the high level of that? Because now we're talking about what's the stuff that doesn't survive scrutiny. And I would say, so that would be Spring Energy's Awesome Sauce. Can you give us the high level of that and tell us if you know anything about what's happened since then?
Yeah. So the issue when you are going after a quote unquote whole food gel is you're using a lot of different food components that are not as easy to determine the carbohydrate content. When you're using these sugars, you just weigh it and you're like, okay, this weight is this is literally 20 grams of maltodextrin. Okay, it's 20 grams of carbohydrate. It's pure carbohydrate. It's super easy to measure. But when you have something like white rice and yams and applesauce, those components get a little bit more complicated to measure out the carbohydrates. And so it still doesn't make any sense, though, that they hadn't gone out and tested their product. So the simplest form of testing the content of a gel is they heat it up, right? They heat it up enough to where there's only the kind of debris left with no hydration in the food. Okay. And then they use the weight then to determine how many grams of carbs, protein, and fat are in the substance. So that's what labs would do, is they would take the gel, dehydrate it completely, find the absolute weight there, and then determine how many grams of each macronutrient are in there. So what happened is that apparently Spring Energy hadn't been doing that. They hadn't been actually having a lab verify their carb content.
Okay.
Even as a nutritionist, I was a little skeptical because, like I said, those pure sugars are going to be much less volume per gram of carbohydrate than, say, white rice. White rice, you're going to need more of it to get 50 grams of carbs than you would maltodextrin and fructose, so the volume's higher. So I'm like, wow, 45 grams per gel of carbs in what seems to be a pretty normal-sized gel. I was a little skeptical myself about the exact numbers there, but I just trusted it. I was a big fan too. I used tons of Awesome Sauce. Yeah. So anyway, before they of course didn't say anything. Someone outside of their company decided, this seems a little suspect, and went out, and apparently, if I remember correctly, he had some science-backed degree, where he's like, I'm going to go ahead and weigh it myself and see what the content is. He did everything himself. Sure enough, came back at like 20 grams of carbs rather than the advertised 45.
Wow.
And so that immediately went on Reddit, sparked this huge, huge, just like, wow, disappointment. And then people continued to do the lab testing and coming back with the same
consistent
results.
Wow.
Like professional labs, third-party testing, they did the whole shebang. Yeah. When what was disappointing is Spring came back with a statement that was like, oh, it must have just been a bad batch. It must have just been, our manufacturers. Oh, it's their fault. Like, it was so irresponsible, their response, that just dug them a deeper grave. I think it was like, you could have just taken responsibility there and said, we've been aware and we're sorry. We should have addressed this. But instead, they kind of just tried to say, it was just one batch.
It's not our fault.
And so
I actually reached out to them and said, hey, it's because my background's in PR. I was like, hey, I would love to be a part of helping rehabilitate. The number one thing that you first have to do is go out and say that you did this. Like, you have to do that, because everyone would respect the hell out of that if you were like, yeah, and we got caught. And it's because any other excuse is like, well, then it's complete, like, even if it's not malicious, it's disregard for, first off, the FDA regulation. You put stuff on packaging, you have to, like, that's a complete disregard. So it's either malicious or stupid.
Yeah.
You're one of the two. And so just own up to it, and then let's go forward and like do some level of like intense, like content around the intense scrutiny to make sure that your product is as advertised. But I got pretty far with a few conversations with them, and then
Oh, really?
yeah, they kept kind of passing me around like, okay, yeah, talk to this guy, then talk to this guy.
Yeah.
But then nothing came of it. But because I loved it. I was like, actually, I've given you a lot of money. I'd hate to see all that money just wasted and the brand go away. I like your core value proposition of having some whole food components to what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And that is attractive to a lot of people. And so what they did is, okay, the awesome sauce has 180 calories. Let's continue to focus on that.
Yeah.
They realized they couldn't get enough carbs in each gel to stick with the 45 grams, but they knew they could stick with the 180 calories by adding fat. So they've actually added, I believe, both MCT oil and a little avocado oil to get those amounts up. I have not tried the new formulation, but I don't think they're doing themselves any favors by increasing fat, because like I said, that's something that can be harder to digest. So their formulation is like, okay, well, we're kind of desperately trying to get to 180 now. We know that we can't hit the carbs. Fat is more energy dense, 9 calories per gram. So let's just add in more fat. So I want to say it's like they've retested, and you go on the website and they have right away the link of, this is our, verified analysis of our gels. Like
Great.
we've done this now. And I want to say the new Awesome Sauce is like 28 grams, but it's still $4.20, So the price hasn't changed. The carbs have gone down. And again, when you're shopping around for gels, you kind of want to think, what's the dollar per gram ratio here? And Spring's just about one of the worst ratios you can find, So, and what's tough too is it wasn't just the Awesome Sauce; it was all their gels. So even the Canterbury, which no longer is called the Canterbury, named after Sage Candidate, that also came in. It was crazy. It was advertised as like 22 grams or something, and it came out as like 9 grams.
Whew.
So it was their whole line. So they've kind of reformulated. But what's interesting looking at their site is, so the branding of each gel was after somebody's name. Sage Candidate did Canterbury. There was
the peanut butter one.
The peanut butter one, I don't think had a brand name on it, but now all of them, instead of having the kind of name of the pro that was behind it, they now just say like fruit smoothie flavor. Like they had to take the names out of it. And all those guys are with other brands now. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot. I don't know if they're surviving me. What's interesting is if you go to their website, they seem to be doing, I can't tell if it's something similar to the feed where they're basically just a site now to go find other products as well, but they have this like guest brand on there. It's like Energly instead of Energy. So they have a different brand on their site. So my thought is they are probably trying to do like, okay, let's kind of look at what the feed is doing, which if listeners aren't familiar, the feed is kind of a one-stop shop online where you can get all your nutrition products and most companies are there. It's a pretty cool thing that I'm super hyped on that they're doing that. Maybe Spring is trying to do that with like more natural based gels. Maybe they're like the website now where you go for, more natural brands. I wonder if they're going in that direction. I have no idea, but to have a guest brand on their website is a pretty really interesting move.
Yeah. I'm looking it up. MySpringEnergy.com.
Yeah, MySpring Energy, and then you can kind of see they've got this guest brand. It's kind of cool. They've got like adaptogenic, mushrooms in there. They've got like different blends, but it seems to be they're partnering with other people. And what that ends up being in the long term, who knows? But
did this lead to any more Did this lead to any more like citizen journalism? Like were people out there now testing a bunch of products? Because on some level, I love this because it kind of came from, the ground level, came from the street level, and someone discovered it. But then it just makes me think, well, have they all lived up to that scrutiny? I mean, are better brands are probably stewarding their products better than sounds like Spring was, but does everybody else seem to be any other brands that have stood out of where not as advertised?
Yeah, I feel the same. I feel every brand should have that on their site now after
Yeah.
seeing this. No other brands have gotten as much scrutiny, and they have done some testing in the mix of this. So some people were like, let me test Spring against, say, Precision, carbs, which is another brand, and that
Mm-hmm.
checked out. They've done some research articles on different brands and showed their validity and their claims, and they're all like within 95% accurate. So they have tested other brands, all the other brands, again, because they're like, I think they're just setting themselves up to make it a lot easier when they're more simple sugars. But these whole food ingredients is where it gets really tough,
Yeah.
honestly, yeah, I mean, I would imagine with Spring Energy, they're picking the exact same amount of weight of each ingredient, but like, yeah, there could be like an apple that maybe wasn't like
Right.
quite the same as the other apple, and so
Right.
maybe the contents of that apple are a little less on the carbs. Maybe it wasn't picked at the right time, and so it's a little
Yeah.
more sour than sweet, less carbohydrate. It's really complicated, I would imagine, when you're using whole foods to make sure everything's,
Right. That's what I was saying. I mean, that's nature. Like there's some
yeah,
built-in variability. You'd expect that. So as a brand, you're vulnerable to that.
yeah.
So it would seem like your carbs would have to be a range. Like we're a range of
Yeah,
40 to 50.
yeah, that's a good point. You may have to do something like that when there's so much variability, or
Yeah.
or they just somehow go through. The manufacturer is able to know for sure, for certain, on each ingredient before it gets to you, and your gel is
Yeah.
another option. So,
Yeah. All right. One last question here, and the setup is this: is an hour after listening to this, people are going they're going to remember 5% of what we've said at most, and by day two, they're remembering one or two sentences. And a week from now, hopefully, this was such an impactful episode that they have one takeaway. And a lot of times, you think about that strategically, like what's something that you want them to take away. My question to you is, because we've talked about carbs from a nutrition perspective, doesn't have to be brands, doesn't have to be smoke and mirrors within the nutrition industry. What the runners who are running right now or who are planning to go for a run today, as it relates to carbs, what's one thing you think every runner who's new to the sport or hasn't thought about nutrition a ton, what's one thing they should know about carbs?
it's by far the most important macronutrient to focus on during exercise.
Okay.
Uh, it is it is the lowest hanging fruit for performance.
Okay.
Carbohydrates are what give our muscle energy. Our muscles don't have energy, we don't perform. It is the easiest way to see gains in your performance is by ingesting carbohydrates during training so that you can be familiar with it in racing. So gradually getting used to carbohydrates more and more, finding kind of your threshold, like basically creating a plan so that
Yeah.
when race day comes, you're dialed and those
Yeah.
carbohydrates are coming in smoothly and
Yeah.
efficiently with water, with sodium, with electrolytes. If you got everything dialed and you're able to consume enough carbohydrates, you're going to be blown away by the difference in performance. And this is the whole high carb movement thing
Yeah.
going on right now. Like people are seeing how night and day it can be, how to
Yeah.
make yourself ingest carbohydrates for long periods of times. There's tips and tricks, but do not sleep on carbohydrate intake.
Okay.
There is somewhat of I'd say a very small niche group of people in the ultra running space pushing low carb even during activities. But there's just they're basically just kind of going against the science of
Yeah.
what's real. Like there's so many science based studies done on lower carb versus higher carb and their output and intensity, and you're just going to get a lot higher output and the most out of yourself with carb intake, whether that's through homemade options, whether that's through purchased gels, practicing with it, getting used to it. It is going to help you out a lot in your performance. So really like, one gel per hour kind of thing is not going to work anymore. Well, maybe a 50 gram carbs fuel, but like a goo 22 gram gel per hour, you're not tapping into your potential at all.
Oh, wow.
Like you got to try it. You got to try more.
All right. And I have to ask, so this is part B to that question. So because we're hearing this, like, okay, we're going to go push carbs. Is there a danger in having what the consequences of going too big on carbs? Is there a consequence? Is there a feeling? Is that going to hurt me in any way in my performance?
Yeah, there is a limit at which the GI system will start to reject what you're putting in it. Okay. There's only so much you can do to kind of transport the sugars from your bloodstream into your cells. Okay. So once you surpass that ability of, transporting and getting it out of the bloodstream, and it starts to build up, you're going to, inevitably, get sick in some form. So there is an upper limit. You can't try 200 grams of carbs per hour. The most we're seeing kind of top end, I've heard of 160 grams per hour in runners, which is crazy. Cycling 150, 160 grams per hour is actually really common. Oh, wow. But take into account cycling is quite different. Again, going back to the jostling effect of running, you cannot, most people cannot go that high. The kind of, higher end right now that seems sustainable for most is kind of 100 to 120 grams per hour. So still a lot, still very high end. But from what we're used to seeing and hearing about even like 3-4 years ago, that is really pushing the limit. But yeah, if you're even with a lot of hydration and you're still feeling sick and throwing up, you probably are going a little bit too high. And it takes time, right? So there's receptors in your intestine that are actually like responding to the carbohydrate intake. So you get more and more receptors the more you practice that are able to transport the glucose more effectively. So there's actually physiological adaptations happening that take time to happen. And so if you train with them, you can gradually increase your carb intake and then, eventually get to a place where 100 grams per hour feels comfortable. But from 0 to 100, the body doesn't adjust that way. So that's why there's this whole niche right now where like I specifically focus on that protocol. I focus on, race day performance nutrition. And that's like, there's so much to address just right there. There's so much to go over in just those details. So it's something that, can be very helpful for people to get the most out of themselves.
Yeah, man, that's amazing. Well, Jesse, nutritionrundown.com, right?
Nutritionrundown.com. Exactly.
Nice. All right, man. Well, I appreciate you joining me today. I look forward to doing this again. And if any of you are looking for a nutritionist, maybe Jesse has some openings. But if not, nothing else, you'll see in the show notes his Instagram. Give him a follow and connect with him there too. Thanks, man.
Thanks,
appreciate
Josh.
you.
Appreciate it.
See you.